He didn't want the dog. He didn't want any of it. Not the wet nose pressed against his boot, not the sound of claws scraping against the porch boards, not the way the animal looked up at him with eyes that asked for nothing and somehow made him feel like he owed the world everything he had left. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house in the high desert outside of Tucson, coffee going cold in his hand, and stared down at the thing. It was a German shepherd, 8 weeks old, maybe 9, a female, he could tell that much, black and tan, ribs visible under patchy fur, one ear folded wrong like it hadn't decided yet what shape it wanted to be. She was trembling. The morning air was still cold in early March, and she had nothing but herself against it. He looked at her for a long time, then he stepped back inside and closed the door. His name was Clifton Ware, 53 years old. Former Navy SEAL, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq. He had a Purple Heart he kept in a shoebox under the bed and a Distinguished Service Medal he'd never framed. He had 12 acres of high desert scrub, a vegetable garden he maintained with the same precision he'd once applied to threat assessments, and a border collie mix named Atlas, who had died the previous November after 14 years. Of being the only living creature Clifton had consistently been glad to come home to. He did not want another dog. He had been clear about that. He had told his daughter, Savannah, who called every Sunday evening from Portland. He had told his neighbor Frank Riley, who ran cattle on the adjacent property and had a habit of stopping by uninvited. He had told the woman at the feed store in town who had suggested, helpfully, that maybe a new companion would help him through the grief. He didn't call it grief. He called it quiet, and he said he preferred it. The German shepherd puppy scratched at his door again. He heard her through the kitchen wall, a sound like sandpaper, light and uncertain, then a small sound, not quite a whimper, something more like a question. Clifton set down his coffee, pulled on his boots, and opened the door again. She was still there. Of course she was. She had nowhere else to go. He crouched down, not touching her, and looked at her more carefully this time. No collar. No tag. Her paws were raw in one spot, like she'd been walking on rough ground for some hours. Her eyes were amber, almost gold, and she held his gaze with a steadiness that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. "Where did you come from?" he said. It wasn't really a question. She put one paw on his knee. He stood up, went back inside, poured half a can of leftover chicken broth into a bowl, and brought it out to her. "That's all," he said. "Don't get comfortable." She drank every drop. He found out where she came from 2 days later when Frank Raley came by and mentioned that a rancher named Gus Pettifer, 3 properties over, had found a litter of 5 under his equipment shed. Mother dog had given birth there in the cold and then wandered off and died, possibly from something she'd eaten out on the range. Gus had taken the puppies to the shelter in town, 4 of them. He'd thought there were only 4. Clifton didn't say anything about that for a moment. "She walked pretty far for a 9-week-old, he said finally. Frank shrugged. Dogs find where they need to be. Clifton didn't respond to that. He handed Frank a cup of coffee. They talked about the fence line along the east pasture, and then Frank left. He looked out the window. The puppy was asleep in the patch of morning sun near the garden, one ear still folded wrong, the other standing up perfectly, like she was listening for something even in her sleep. He hadn't named her. He was not going to name her. The problem was that she needed things. That was the first complication he hadn't fully accounted for. She needed to be fed, not just chicken broth, real food, puppy food with the right protein ratios, which meant a trip to the feed store in town. She needed to be warm at night, which in March in the high desert meant below 40 degrees. He'd put a folded blanket in an old laundry basket on the covered porch, and she'd slept there the first night. And he'd lain awake inside listening for sounds that might mean she was in distress, which was not how he'd planned to spend a Tuesday. She needed to go out at 3 in the morning, apparently, every morning, without fail, without mercy, without any apparent awareness that he was a grown man who had slept through worse things than this, and resented the loss of it now. The third morning, standing on the porch at 3:15 in the cold, watching her sniff a rock like it contained critical intelligence, Clifton said out loud to no one, "This is not what I signed up for." She looked at him over her shoulder, one ear up, one ear sideways. He pointed at the rock. "Nothing is happening over there, I promise you." She went back to sniffing the rock. He crossed his arms and waited. The stars over the Sonoran Desert were extraordinary at that hour. He'd forgotten that. He'd spent enough nights in places where the sky was all he had. Kandahar, the Korangal Valley, a FOB in Helmand Province where the dust never fully settled, and he'd learned to read stars the way some men read books, finding in them a kind of order that everything below them tended to contradict. He hadn't looked at the stars much since Atlas died. It had seemed like the kind of thing you did with company. He looked at them now, by accident, because there was nothing else to look at, while a 9-week-old German shepherd inspected desert geology at 3 in the morning. They were extraordinary. He didn't tell anyone that. Savannah called that Sunday. She asked how he was doing. He said fine. She asked about the garden. He said the tomatoes were slow, but the green chiles were coming in ahead of schedule. She asked if he'd been seeing anyone, by which she meant friends, not romantically, because she'd long since stopped asking about that. He told her there was a dog. A silence. What kind of dog? German shepherd. Puppy. Another silence. Dad, I thought you said. I know what I said. Okay. He could hear her choosing her words. Savannah was 31 years old and had her mother's way of doing that. That deliberate pause before she spoke, as though she was giving her first instinct a chance to sit down before she let it talk. It was one of the things about her that made him simultaneously proud and undone. Does it have a name? No. What do you call it? He thought about that. He had been calling her various things. Hey and you, and once, at 3 in the morning, why? He had not said any of these out loud. I call her the dog, he said. Okay, Savannah said again. He could hear the smile in it, barely restrained. Okay, Dad. They talked for another 20 minutes. When he hung up, the dog was sitting at his feet, watching him in the calm, total way that puppies watched things before they learned to look away. Don't read into that, he told her. She yawned. It was an enormous yawn for such a small animal, showing every tooth she had, which were very small and very white and very sharp. As he had already discovered when she'd decided his bootlaces were a threat. He scratched her once behind the left ear, the one that was starting to stand up properly now. She leaned into his hand like she'd been waiting for it her whole life. He pulled his hand away and went to make dinner. He named her Roja. It was not a name he'd planned. He'd been looking at her one evening in the early light, the way the fading sun caught the deep russet along her back and shoulders. Not quite red, not quite brown, something in between that the desert afternoon had its own particular word for. And the name was just there, the way things sometimes arrived without asking permission. He didn't tell anyone for a week. It felt like a concession he hadn't been ready to make. The thing about Atlas, and here was the part he didn't talk about, the part he hadn't talked about with Savannah or Frank Riley or anyone, was that Atlas had been with him the year his wife died. Clifton's wife, Donna, had passed from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago in April, quick and brutal the way that cancer tends to be, and Atlas had understood something in those weeks that no person had managed to communicate. Atlas had stayed close. Not hovering, he wasn't a hovering kind of dog, but near, lying near the bedroom door in the mornings, sleeping on Donna's side of the bed for the first 3 months, which Clifton had allowed because he hadn't had the heart to move him. When Atlas died, what Clifton had lost wasn't just a dog. He knew that. He knew it intellectually. What he'd lost was the last living creature who had known him during those months, who carried that particular weight in its memory, who had been there in a way that required nothing of him. No explanation, no performance of okayness, no answer to how are you really doing. He had thought he was done with that, with the particular vulnerability of being known. Roja, apparently, had not been consulted on this decision. She was 3 months old now, and she had opinions. She had opinions about the order in which the morning should proceed, outside first, food second. A brief period of being told she was doing a good job, then and only then would she allow him to drink his coffee in peace. She had opinions about the garden. The tomato cages were suspicious. The hose was suspicious. A single crow that had landed on the fence post 3 weeks ago remained, in her view, an unresolved matter. She had opinions about his left boot, which she still regarded with the mild hostility of someone who hadn't forgotten an old grievance. He started to know her the way you know a place, not all at once, but by accumulation, by returning to it until the small things became familiar and the familiar things became necessary. He learned that she slept with her nose tucked under her tail when she was cold. He learned that she had a particular trot that meant she'd found something worth investigating, versus a full run that meant she'd found something actually interesting. He learned that the sideways ear, which still occasionally defaulted to its original folded position when she was tired, was the ear she tilted toward him when he was talking, like she was making sure she didn't miss anything. He learned that she was better company than he'd intended to allow. The worst night was in April. He had dreams, sometimes. Not every night, not even most nights anymore, but sometimes, and they were of a specific type. Not combat, exactly. Not the things people assumed veterans dreamed about when they assumed things. They were about the moments just before. The quality of light. The specific weight of a silence that was about to break. He'd learned, a long time ago, that the dreams weren't something to manage so much as something to wait out, the way you waited out weather. But April was the anniversary of Donna's death, and that particular week the dreams came back with a kind of insistence he hadn't prepared for. He woke at 2 in the morning in a state that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief, and was mostly the particular animal confusion of being a body that had been somewhere else. He lay still for a moment the way he'd trained himself to, just breathing, just identifying. He was in his bedroom, in his house, in the desert, and nothing was wrong. He became aware that Roja was on the bed. She was not supposed to be on the bed. She knew this. He had established this clearly, and more than once, and she had accepted it with the practical flexibility of someone who understood a rule's jurisdictions extended only as far as its enforcement. She was pressed against his left side, all 40 pounds of her, warm and solid, her chin resting on his arm. He didn't move her. He lay there in the dark with the weight of her against him, and his heart rate came down, and the particular quality of the dark shifted from something that pressed into something that simply was, and eventually he slept again. In the morning, she was back on her bed on the floor, the very picture of a dog who had never been anywhere else. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know what you did," he said. She thumped her tail once, twice, and looked at the door, indicating that the morning needed to proceed in the correct order. He got up. In May, he called Savannah and told her the dog's name. "Roja," Savannah said. "It means red. Her coloring. I know what it means, Dad." A pause. "It's a beautiful name." He cleared his throat. "She's a good dog." "I'm glad," Savannah said, and her voice had something in it that he recognized as careful and didn't want to examine too closely. "I'm really glad." He changed the subject to the green chiles, which were excellent this year. The thing that happened in June was not the thing he'd expected. He'd taken Roja out to the east pasture in the late afternoon. She'd started going with him on the property checks, which had begun as something he allowed and had become something he relied on. She worked beside him with a seriousness that still sometimes surprised him, her nose to the ground or lifted to read the air, doing whatever it was she was doing with a kind of purposeful focus that he recognized from his own working life. She wasn't trained for anything. She was just paying attention the way some creatures naturally did. The afternoon was hot, the way June in the Sonoran was, the kind of heat that sat on everything and made the air wavy above the scrub brush. He was checking the fence along the ravine that ran at the eastern edge of his property. A rocky cut about 20 feet deep, dry at this time of year, good for nothing except occasionally collecting debris after heavy rains. Roja stopped. Not the stop she used for ordinary things, not the sudden freezing that meant she'd caught a scent worth investigating. This was different. She stopped and turned and looked at him, then turned back and looked toward the ravine, and made a sound he hadn't heard from her before. Not a bark, a low, urgent vocalization that he felt more than heard. "What?" he said. She moved toward the ravine, stopped, looked at him again. He followed her. He heard it before he saw it. A small sound, thin and exhausted, the sound of something that had been making noise for a long time and was running out of the ability to continue. Down in the ravine, wedged in a crevice between two large rocks about 8 feet below the edge, was a boy, maybe 8 years old. Dark hair, one sneaker missing, a scrape along the side of his face that had dried dark. He was looking up at Clifton with eyes that were glassy from sun and whatever hours he'd spent down there. Clifton was on his stomach at the edge of the ravine before he'd consciously decided to move, assessing the drop, the rocks, the angle of the boy's position, what he had on him, what he didn't. "Hey," he said, "look at me. What's your name?" "Mateo," the boy said. His voice was a thread. "Mateo, okay. I've got you. Can you move your legs?" A pause. "I think so." "Okay, I need you to do something for me." "Can you do something for me?" The boy nodded. Clifton talked him through it the way he'd talked people through things in circumstances that were considerably less forgiving than this one. Calm, sequential, no wasted words. He went back to the truck for the tow rope he kept behind the seat, tied it off on the bumper, and went back down to the ravine's edge. It took 15 minutes. It felt like less. When the boy was up and over the edge and sitting on the ground, Clifton sat beside him and took stock, dehydrated, scared, superficial lacerations. Nothing broken. Roja sat in front of the boy and pushed her nose gently against his hand. Mateo looked at her for a moment. Then he burst into tears. The real kind, the kind that meant he finally felt safe enough to let go. He wrapped both arms around Roja's neck and cried into her fur, and she held absolutely still for it, steady and warm and unmovable. It turned out the boy was the grandson of a woman named Patricia Sandoval, who owned the small horse property that bordered Clifton's land to the south. He'd been missing since noon. He'd gone out to look at the ravine, because 8-year-old boys tended toward ravines, and had slipped on the crumbling edge. Patricia had been looking for him for 4 hours by the time Clifton's phone call reached her. He drove Mateo to the road where Patricia was already running toward them, and he stood back while that reunion happened, which was not something you watched so much as gave space to. On the drive back, Roja rode in the passenger seat instead of the bed of the truck. He'd put her there without thinking about it. He drove for a while in silence. "That was good work," he told her. She looked out the windshield like she was watching the road. He reached over and scratched behind her left ear. She leaned into his hand the same way she always did, with her whole self, like there was no point in doing it partially. He drove the rest of the way home with his hand on her head. He called Savannah that Sunday and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. Roja found him. She found him, Dad. Another pause. "Can I come visit this summer?" He'd been deflecting that question for almost 2 years. He was aware of that. He was aware that Savannah drove up and down the coast of that deflection every time she called, probing gently, pretending she wasn't. "Yeah," he said. "Come in July, the Childs will be ready." She made a sound he hadn't heard from her in a while, surprised and genuine and a little undone. "Okay," she said. July. After he hung up, he sat on the porch in the early evening. The desert was cooling down, the way it did fast after the sun went, the air sharpening into something almost sweet. The stars were beginning to show at the edge of the sky. Roja was next to his chair, leaning against his leg, watching the dark come in the same direction he was. He thought about Donna the way he usually did in the evenings, not with the acute pain that had been the first years, not with the dull ache that had been the middle years, but with something quieter now. Something that felt less like loss and more like carrying, like the weight of something valuable that you had agreed to hold. Because it deserved to be held, because putting it down would be its own kind of wrong. He thought about Atlas, lying on Donna's side of the bed in those first months, the sheer uncomplicated goodness of that. He put his hand on Roja's back, and she sighed, a long, settling sound, and leaned more firmly against his leg. The stars came out over the desert, all of them, the way they did out here, more than you could count, more than you could need. He looked at them for a long time. He didn't look away. Patricia Sandoval stopped by the following week with tamales wrapped in foil and a card that Mateo had made himself. Crayon on construction paper, a drawing of a man and a dog standing at the top of a ravine, stick-figure arms raised in what appeared to be triumph. He put it on the refrigerator. It was the first thing on his refrigerator in 5 years. Roja sat below it and looked up at it for a moment, then apparently decided it was not a threat, and went to find a patch of sun. He made coffee and invited Patricia to stay for a cup, and she did, and they talked about the fence line and the heat and Mateo's persistent interest in things he shouldn't climb, and it was the longest conversation he'd had with another person in his kitchen in longer than he wanted to calculate. When she left, he stood in the doorway and watched her truck until it turned back onto the county road. He was aware, in a way that was unfamiliar and not entirely unwelcome, that the house felt different, not empty, not quiet in the way that quiet had felt like a wall, something else, more like space, like a room that had been closed for too long and was now getting some air. Roja appeared at his knee. "Don't get smug," he told her. She looked up at him with the amber eyes, steady and unhurried. He looked down at her. Then he went inside and called his daughter to confirm July, and he wrote it on the calendar. And that was the first thing he'd written on the calendar in a long time, too. Savannah came on the 12th of July, and she stayed for 10 days. She was taller than he remembered, or maybe he'd been looking at her wrong over the phone for 2 years. She had Donna's dark eyes and his way of standing, weight on the left foot, arms loose, like she was always half a second from something that needed doing. She walked in the front door and looked at the refrigerator and saw Mateo's drawing and said nothing for a moment, and then said, very quietly, "Hi, Dad," and put her arms around him. Roja sat between them and looked at Savannah with an expression that conveyed polite professional evaluation. "She's beautiful," Savannah said, crouching down. "She knows it," Clifton said. Roja allowed a brief examination and then stood and walked to the door, indicating that tours of the property were available and should be commenced at his earliest convenience. They walked the 12 acres in the late afternoon light, the 3 of them, the dog out ahead of them through the scrub brush and back again in the way she had, ranging and returning, and Clifton showed Savannah the garden and the ravine where they'd found Mateo and the fence line where the quail liked to run at dusk. Savannah asked questions. About the ranch, about the neighbors, about Patricia Sandoval and the tamales. About Roja. She asked about Roja the way she'd always asked about Atlas, with the specific attentiveness of someone who understood that the dog was a window into something that Clifton wouldn't open directly. He answered. He answered more than he'd expected to. On the last evening, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset go through its complicated colors over the desert, the purples and golds and the deep, specific orange that existed only in that high, dry air. Roja was between their chairs, lying flat with her chin on the ground, drowsing. "I was worried about you," Savannah said. "I know after Mom, and then Atlas." She paused. "You got so quiet. I was always quiet, different quiet." She looked at him. "But you seem," she thought about it. "You seem more like yourself." He thought about that. What it meant to be more like yourself. Whether that was a direction or a return, or whether at 53 it was something else entirely, something you kept building in whatever direction the materials were available. "She's a good dog," he said finally. Savannah looked at Roja. "She really is." The desert held its particular evening silence, which was not really silence. There were insects, and somewhere a coyote had started up, and the wind moved through the scrub brush with a dry sound like turning pages. Roja's ear moved toward the coyote and then relaxed. Assessed. Not a threat. Returned to drowsing. He watched his daughter watch the sunset. He thought about the years he'd spent getting this quiet wrong, believing that it was protection, not understanding that it was also a door he'd shut on himself from the inside. The coyote called again, farther away now. The first stars showed at the top of the sky. Roja lifted her head, looked at Clifton, looked at Savannah, thumped her tail once. All present. All accounted for. He looked out at the desert he'd been looking at alone for 5 years and thought, so this is what it was waiting to look like. He didn't say that. He wasn't a man who said things like that. But he thought it, and that was enough. And the evening settled around them like something that had been practicing for this, and they sat there in it until the stars were fully out, and the air had gone silver cold, and nobody moved to go inside.